Thank you, Jim. You may begin. Thank you.
There we go. Good morning. I hope the day for the folks up at the Christine Center is as beautiful as it is here in Milwaukee. Today is Wednesday, dear Tay, dear Sangha, dear esteemed teacher. Today is Wednesday, August 4th, 2021. I'm Jim Barrett, and I'm speaking via Zoom to the summer retreat of the Milwaukee Mindfulness Center being held at the Christine Center in Willard, Wisconsin. I'm Zooming from my home in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I appreciate Paul mentioning that I was ordained in 2017, and I've never quite figured out, was the true transmission of the Dharma that which was supposed to be given to me or that which I am supposed to give? I don't know, but at any rate, don't need to know. Vows of gratitude to the technology that allows us to be together, even as my physical challenges keep us apart. My path and the teachings have taught me that physical challenges are a wonderful opportunity to practice. I practice. Vows also to our dear friend and teacher, Paul Norton, for asking me to do this talk. I hope my humble efforts provide something for thought and discussion. Please bear in mind that our way has no dogma. So I ask that this discourse be treated not as truth, but as the results of the incomplete understanding of my research. To quote the fictional character Valentine Michael Smith, I grok it, but not in fullness. And please allow us to remember from Shunryo Suzuki Roshi, what we do here is so important, we'd better not take it too seriously. Our subject today is an exploration of non-duality, perhaps as presented to us in part in the poem Affirming Faith in Mind. The far enemy, the easily recognized opposite of non-duality, is of course duality. The near enemy of non-duality, that which could be confused with non-duality, could be consensus. And consensus can look very much like non-duality, but it is in fact almost always arrived at through compromise that shadows a duality. I'm not convinced. I would be pleased to entertain a discussion on this subject, the near enemy of non-duality. I wonder if what the American Tibetan teacher Pema Chodron called idiot compassion would qualify. Idiot compassion is a great expression which was actually coined by Trungpa Rinpoche. It refers to something we all do a lot of, and we call it compassion. In some ways, it's what's called enabling. It's the general tendency to give people what they want because you can't bear to see them suffer. Homo erectus started the hunter-gatherer lifestyle 1.8 million years ago. Homo sapiens seem to have emerged about 200,000 years ago and made the transition to agricultural communities around 10,000 BCE. So our brains, our bodies, our reactivity are all shaped by those thousands of generations to find out if this different thing is something for fight, flight, freeze. Every time we saw a stranger, an other, come across the horizon, we saw competition. Competition for food, for mates, for shelter. What else is important? Instantaneously forming an opinion was a necessity. If not, you didn't get a chance to have your genes continue to frolic in the gene pool. Not a good thing for most creatures. I'll bet some of you have heard the story of Bob and Og. Bob and Og were hunter-gatherers gathering across the savannah one day millennia ago when they were faced with a quandary. What was that up ahead, partially obscured by a bush? Bob was pretty sure it was a lion. Og was pretty sure it was a potential mate. After a short discussion, Og decided to approach his newfound mate. It turned out to be a lion, and he was snatched up and eaten. This helps to explain, to a certain extent, why there's a lot of people today named Bob, not so many named Og. One might say Og was overly optimistic or Bob was properly pessimistic, but we're back to that old gene pool thing. The Bobs got to sire and help raise kids that might lean a little bit in the direction of being paranoid and a touch neurotic. The neurons that fire together wire together, and the next thing you know, a lot of us have neuroplasticized this automatic sense of duality. It kept our ancestors alive. Easy to see how the habit of energies of 1.8 million years haven't caught up even in the last several thousand. Our perceptions are formed and shaped by the seeds in our store consciousness. I'm certain you've heard about seeds so far. These seeds are the kernel of our biases, consciously and subconsciously, implicit and explicit. Implicit biases are those that we can't remember being created. Perhaps as a very young child, we sat for hours watching the antics of a certain Popeye. Every time Popeye was on the ropes, he whipped out his can of spinach. And hey presto, any problems were solved with an adroit application of violence. A 4 or 5-year-old can get any number of meanings from such examples. When the going gets tough, find some spinach. Or somebody messes with your girl, smack them a good one, even if it's only in your mind. Explicit biases are those whose precipitating factors are recognized and remembered. A dear friend of my wife once had a flamingo chase her at the zoo when she was a child. She remembers the fear, the panic the large bird created in her, and now, decades later, the friend cringes at the sight of a plastic flamingo on a lawn. In his book, Heart of the Buddha's Teaching, here's what Thich Nhat Hanh said about perception. The Buddha advised us not to be fooled by what we perceive. He told Subhuti, here, where there is perception, there is deception. The Buddha also taught on many occasions that most of our perceptions are erroneous and that most of our suffering comes from wrong perceptions. We have to ask ourselves again and again, am I sure? Until we see clearly our wrong perceptions will prevent us from having right view. The source of our perceptions, our way of seeing, lies in our store consciousness. If 10 people look at a cloud, there will be 10 different perceptions of it. Whether it is perceived as a dog, a hammer, or a coat depends on your mind. Our sadness, our memories, our anger, our perceptions carry with them all the errors of subjectivity. Then we praise, blame, condemn, or complain, depending on our perceptions, but our perceptions are made of our afflictions, craving, anger, ignorance, wrong views, and prejudice. Whether we are happy or we suffer depends largely on our perceptions. It is important to look deeply at our perceptions and know their source. That might vary, in my opinion, that might very well be one of the most revealing pieces that Thich Nhat Hanh ever wrote. Many of us may remember when our parents were automatically wrong, even when it turned out that they were right. We nitpicked about it. Sam Clemens / Mark Twain, by way of Hal Holbrook, said, when I was 16, I was certain that my father was the most ignorant person ever to exist. By the time I was 21, I was amazed at how wise he was about so many things. I always wondered how he got so smart in only 6 years. But let's be realistic here. We've got this finely honed sense of discrimination, contrived to help keep us and ours as safe as a primitive world can be. And now this guy writes a poem a couple of thousand years ago and tells us we should change that and stop seeing things as good, bad, right, wrong. There's a suspicion on my part that somebody's got something confused here. We humans are born and bred opinion makers. We will easily have opinions about things we know nothing about. We will adopt or reject opinions and indeed facts based on where we get them from. The human brain has been developed and conditioned to draw distinctions, create opinions and judgments. It was what kept our ancestors alive, but these are generally based on differences. We could always start from commonality. We both wish to experience happiness and avoid suffering. The neuroscience of how we make decisions in light of our perspectives and biases seems pretty solid. Our seeds, our habit energies, our biases all drive the perception engine that is our brain. For individual or small group survival, that worked. For species survival, maybe not so much. If the universe worked on this, worked out that human beings are dualistic, discriminating creatures, why on earth would we want to move into a non-dualistic way of thinking as seemingly suggested in the affirming faith in mind? As a hunter-gatherer community of 100 to 150 people, we would all have a similar worldview. Our understanding of our world was intimate and mostly the same. It seldom needed modification. But as the world became more populated, more and more contact was made with peoples who did not share the same reality. As our world has grown, perhaps we're finding it not so productive to insist that our tribe is right and the others are wrong. We don't have to admit anything silly like they're right, but perhaps we could quietly admit to ourselves that maybe we don't know all of the truth. This could be the beginning of a non-dualistic attitude. Excuse me. As I was researching for this presentation, I was steered to a blog on the Psychology Today website by Dr. Daniel Stalder, a social scientist at Whitewater University here in Wisconsin. His research on bias fundamentals has led to some very interesting possibilities regarding a person's sense of personal and societal insecurity and their willingness to attach to various conspiracy theories. There also seems to be an increased willingness to see coincidental occurrences as cause and effect. Perhaps I'm misinterpreting here, but it almost seems to me that the more strongly people feel threatened by instability, the more tenuous and far-reaching their grasping and connections become. Dr. Stalder and his researchers seem to have some success in helping folks by introducing thoughts designed to make it okay not to be certain, to entertain the concept that one might be wrong. I remember that as my teacher helped me prepare for my ordination into the Order of Interbeing, it seemed to me at the most inopportune moments, he would look at me and say, "Are you sure?" It didn't take long for me to understand that the only answer to that question was no. Certainly, Dr. Stalder has access to mindfulness experts, and it would be interesting to see research focused on the process of mindful observation and the mindful application of, "Are you sure?" Having someone look over their glasses at one and saying, "Are you sure?" at fairly uncomfortable times seemed to have worked for me. So where does this uncomfortable, somewhat uncomfortable exposition on non-duality we call affirming faith in mind come from? There's a very illuminating commentary on the poem by Chan Master Xing Yen that first off tells us it was written somewhere between 400 and 600 CE. and may or may not have been written by someone named Seng Chan, or perhaps someone else or else's by the same or other names. At any rate, in the introduction, Master Xing Yan indicates that the poem under discussion is an exercise in our meditation practice. I've yet to find any indication that we should set up a process whereby these verses become our daily lives, except that our practice becomes our daily life, and our daily life becomes our practice. Keeping in mind the likely cumulative errors of multiple translations to and from multiple languages and cultures, and we might suspect the Buddha's real intention has been confused somewhere along the line. It seems to me that the teachings we have are full of duality, with probably no one more surprised than the Buddha. Let's start with the Four Noble Truths. There's the inherent concept that there is suffering and that there can be an end to suffering. Sounds like a bit of duality regarding suffering, not suffering. Although, as I was reminded, what the Buddha taught was that suffering exists, not that it was good or bad or to be embraced or avoided, just that it exists and should be experienced. The Noble Eightfold Path is full of stuff like right or wise livelihood, right or wise speech, and right or wise understanding. All seem to imply a not right or not wise alternative to each of these examples. The Buddha has said to us, the Buddha said, that we should follow the guidelines of wise speech. Is it true? Is it kind? Am I the one to say it? Is now the time for it to be said? We should not kill other living creatures. If our job involves killing other creatures or helping others to kill other creatures, we're supposed to figure out a different way, how to get another way to support ourselves. All that sounds kind of dualistic to me, but what do I know? I'm just a simple peasant. That being said, in my opinion, there are phrases we can firmly embrace in this poem. One of my favorites is, "For things are things because of mind, as mind is mind because of things." This ties directly back to earlier comments about the inaccuracy of our perceptions. Generally speaking, if something causes us pain or suffering, we often have a tendency to label that thing bad. Sometimes that brings us pleasure. That which brings us pleasure or enjoyment will often be called good. Natural tendency, right? But we know it's often not that simple. Things are things because of mind. So many possibilities. Our favorite music might be from a time when we were the happiest or the most engaged. Someone else may hear the same music and recall that they were in an abusive relationship at that time, not their favorite music. Mind is mind because of things. Sorry, when I contemplate this, I keep coming back to an old saying I've been hearing and using for decades. When your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Or nowadays, perhaps, if your only tool is a gun, every problem looks like whatever. Some people come to the path, to the practice, to the retreat, to their cushion, looking to get grounded. Perhaps accepting groundlessness is the ultimate in non-duality. An acceptance that the universe is constantly changing versus a wholesale rejection of the world as it is in favor of the world as we wish it to be. Something, anything, permanent and unchanging. Turning again to Anipema, she tells us that groundlessness is akin to going out to sea on a boat. At first, you're unsteady on your feet and in your stomach. You can wonder how you're going to eat, to sleep, to go to the bathroom. A few days later, after considerable suffering, you find yourself doing all of those things effortlessly. You adapted. Some of us from childhood might remember days spent on roller skates or ice skates. We adapted, and it felt strange not to have the grinding of the wheels when we got done. Some of us are learning not to spend much energy on being grounded. Being grounded is usually a way of trying to attach to something permanent. We know nothing is permanent or unchanging, not even the ground under us, and we can't pretend otherwise. For many of us, the most common duality we encounter on our path, and for some of us, it engages us for years, is the, am I doing it right? Even seasoned practitioners sometimes fall into the I'm not doing it right condition. Since there is a thing called meditation, there must be something called meditation instructions. And once I get the instructions, am I following them properly? How about instead just engaging a curious and optimistic attitude about the whole thing? Let's remember our quote from Suzuki Roshi. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. How about we approach our cushion, our meditation, our practice with the non-duality of beginner's mind? Instead of working diligently to follow the instructions, how about sometimes we sit with an anything can happen day attitude and just sit, knowing that we'll be perfect exactly the way it happens. Yes, there's a place for formal meditation, and yes, I taught introduction to meditation for a number of years at the Southside Extension. But the point here is that many of us start our practice with a duality about doing it right or doing it wrong, and we never give it a second thought. But that doesn't mean that we have to accept our automatic responses. Mindfulness means that we can see what our mind is doing, and at that point, we can come back to our breath, decide to do something different, and rewire our response. Remember, the neurons that fire together wire together. So the more we come to our new productive response, the more automatic it will become. Sharon Salzberg tells us the mindfulness helps us get better at seeing the difference between what's happening and the stories we tell ourselves about what's happening. Stories that get in the way of direct experience. Often such stories treat a fleeting state of mind as if it were our entire and permanent self. And I wish I had a nickel for every time that happened to me. In the long run, our old automatic responses, our habit energies, are a form of what our dear teacher Pema Chodron calls a shenpa, an attachment, attaching to drawing something to you or to pushing something away from you. According to Ani Pema, in these cases, the solution is to do something different. That's right. Recognize that our duality has led us into a negative behavior or state of mind. Make note of it and do something different from the habitual response. Even if it's not the most productive response, at least one is breaking the pattern. The Turgar teacher, Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, in his book, The Joy of Living, reminds us that the mind is the source of all experience, and by changing the direction of the mind, we can change the quality of everything we experience. I choose to apply this in my own little way. I find myself plodding along, perhaps dragging the garbage out to the alley. I will stop, come back to my breath, and remember that everything is either part of the job, a chore to be done, or a part of the dance of life, an experience to be lived with a sense of being. And I'm the one who decides. Somewhere along the line, taking out the garbage became a good, bad thing and a part of the job. But I can change that. I can make it a part of the dance of life, to be experienced brightly, brightly, and with beauty. I'm not quite able to fully experience taking out the garbage in the ultimate dimension yet, but perhaps someday. For things are things because of mind, as mind is mind because of things. One of my favorite stories about non-duality has origins long lost. The ancient Chinese parable speaks of an old man and his wife on their farm with one son and one horse. His neighbors used to hang around and tell him how lucky he was to have a horse to pull his cart. The old man would always reply, maybe good, maybe bad, who's to know? One day the horse ran away. The neighbors came around and commiserated with him, saying, what lousy luck. Now you don't have any horse at all. To which, of course, the old man replied, maybe good, maybe bad, who's to know? 2 days later, the old man's horse returned, and with it, 5 wild horses. Of course, you can figure out that by this time the neighbors were around and all proclaimed, what wonderful luck. Now you'll be a rich man. You have 6 horses. And of course, the old man replied, maybe good, maybe bad, who's to know? A few days later, the old man's son decided to train one of the new horses for riding. He was promptly bucked off and broke a leg in the process. Once again, the neighbors came around wailing, what awful luck. How will you be able to get your work done now? To which the farmer replied, maybe good, maybe bad, who's to know? The next day, the army came into town and conscripted all the able-bodied young men, except for the old man's son, whose leg was in a cast. Maybe good, maybe bad, who's to know? If the old man had chosen to cling to his neighbor's duality, he could have very easily provided himself with a tremendous amount of stress and sorrow. Instead, he chose to keep an attitude of maybe good, maybe bad, who's to know? And I'll take a quick swipe at reminding us that this acceptance is not the same as agreement. But things are things because of mind, and mind is mind because of things. My teacher talks of the post-it note theory of emotions. We have an emotion, say maybe fear, and we have an overwhelming desire to attach it to something. Perhaps what we're afraid of is too scary to actually look at. For a variety of reasons, we can't just sit around and experience it. So like a post-it note, we stick it to something, anything. If it's a positive emotion, we will probably decide we like what we're sticking it to it. If it's a negative emotion, we'll probably be deciding that we will be think of the thing we stuck it to as bad. Or does it go the other way around? We stick a distressing feeling or emotion on something we've already decided, consciously or subconsciously, as a negative. Neuroscience tells us that this is probably the way it actually works. We sometimes lose our sense of non-duality because it's too uncomfortable for us to look at different viewpoints. Those of a different political party or religious persuasion must be deluded to believe as they do. If they don't change their viewpoints after we explain it to them, then we must not have explained it well enough. Let's explain it again and again and again until they change their minds. Or not. Have we talked about the rider and the elephant? Jonathan Haidt, psychologist and author, in his book, The Righteous Mind, created the model of the rider and the elephant. The rider is the reasoning and intellectual part of ourselves. The elephant is the emotional component and is driven again by our emotions and biases. It would appear that the rider controls the elephant, but many of us know that that's not true. So sometimes, most of the time, if we wish to engage with others who believe in their own truth, we must engage both the rider and the elephant. both the intellect and the emotions. I recently ran across a very interesting clip from Anderson Cooper 360. I do not watch Anderson Cooper on a regular basis, but I thought this one was fairly interesting. He was interviewing Representative Adam Kinzinger, a Republican from Illinois, and Cooper asked him, "What do you think it will take to break this fever?" Kinzinger replied, "If you're on the left, make a friend on the right. If you're on the right, make a friend on the left. Learn their fears. You don't realize you have the same fears. Everybody is fearful of something, and that's what leads to our politics." And as someone who has diligently studied my own fear, I generally tell folks that fear can only stay around for so long before it turns into anger. Perhaps instead of duality, we should contemplate commonality. If nothing else, we can be pretty sure that most of us, including those on the other side, wish to experience happiness and avoid suffering. Of course, we might ask, if our world is social media, how many friends do we have with truly different sides? Where do we go to find them in a conducive atmosphere in such a charged and polarized world? Here's my experience. It's kind of a tough one for me. I had a phone call from a friend who lives in the wilds of Green Bay. After 45 years of friendship, I knew him to be a bright, well-reasoning person with a good heart and mind. He began by telling me he had decided not to be vaccinated for COVID. If in the past he wouldn't take a flu shot, he certainly wouldn't take a dubious COVID-19 shot. Doesn't make any difference what his reasons were. There were his stated reasons and his unstated reasons. There was the rider and the elephant, just as I have my own rider and elephant. Watching myself during this phone conversation, I watched my reactivity as he became more and more sure of nebulous leaps of logic. I stopped the conversation because my brain was about to seize up. The more he retreated into his fundamental religious beliefs and pseudoscience, I hope you see what I did there, minimizing and categorizing his arguments, the more I wanted to say things that would outrage him. This was not going to get us where we needed to go. A few days later, he was insistent that we meet in person. Again, I watched myself as I recoiled at his certainty of things I couldn't reconcile with my knowledge of the world. I was sure that his being sure was wrong. I suggested that his being sure was a red flag. He thought not. After our visit, I tried to figure out ways to keep from having to visit with him again. With a couple of days space since that visit, I now sit quietly and feel what I feel. Here's how one finds the person on the other side. Here's the discomfort. And as is our way, I turn towards my discomfort just as much as I can and just as long as I can, and then retreat when I need to. My friend will be back in a couple of weeks, and I will be both curious and apprehensive. It's certainly possible that I have embraced this concept of uncertainty so strongly that its opposite creates difficulty for me. Or perhaps my grasp of this piece of the Dharma is so tenuous that challenging it causes me distress. I don't know. Don't need to know. I'm a one-trick pony. All I've got is mindfulness, paying attention on purpose with as little judgment as possible. Our remote ancestors and their brains were shaped by a zero-sum worldview. There were only so many wildebeests in a given area, so many of this or that edible plants, so many resources. Taking a stance of non-duality wouldn't feed the family. In a world based on materialism, where we indeed play a zero-sum game. Got to be a winner, got to be a loser, and that's the basis of duality. But if we choose to use minimal resources and base a life on peace and serenity, kindness and compassion, then it's not a zero-sum game anymore. It becomes instead what's been called the infinite game. No winner, no loser. If we see a player about to lose their place in the game, we redistribute resources, change the rules. The more players, the better. For us first world folks, we might be able to choose to live lightly within our environment and economy while we pursue a life built on the positive emotions mentioned before: peace and serenity, kindness and compassion. Living by spiritual guidelines does not diminish anyone else. Duality is a function of the competition mode developed during our hunter-gatherer ancestor stage. Such decisions are usually made below the conscious level and long before we're actually aware of it. Most times they're decided upon by our biases, both implicit and explicit. Yeah, because things are things because of mind, and mind is mind because of things. What could be the value of a non-duality point of view? In her book, The Places That Scare You, Pema Chodron tells us, we get self-righteous about our beliefs and set ourselves solidly for or against others. We take sides. We become closed-minded. We have enemies. This polarization is an obstacle to the genuine equanimity that informs compassionate action. If we wish to alleviate injustice and suffering, we have to do it with an unprejudiced mind. We wish to perform merit, but we do it in duality. That's an interesting proposition. There are teachings that tell us that people who do harmful things to themselves and to others do so because they are deluded about the true nature of the universe. That may be true, but I can't imagine a conversation that starts off with, let me help you see where you're deluded. We'll be very productive, and most everything else is a subterfuge. I'm always kind of heartened and saddened at the same time when I contemplate Thich Nhat Hanh's results during the war in his homeland. When he came to the United States to discuss what the war was doing to the Vietnamese people, he was exiled from his homeland by both sides. He refused to take sides and chose instead to address the destruction and suffering he saw on a daily basis. The dualistic folks insisted that he pick a side, and when he didn't, he was condemned. A man after my own heart. Pissing off everybody on all sides of the situation at one time should tell you something. It might be productive, but it should tell you something. Research has shown that most times compassion comes from a place of, that could be me. I could be in this position. If we're not dwelling in non-duality, is it possible for us to form a state of, that could be me? Pick a mass murderer out of history. Ask yourself, if I had lived that person's life, could I have done the same things? When you quickly assure yourself that you couldn't, visualize me asking, are you sure? We don't know what their minds connected to their, what their minds connected to their things, or how their things connected to their minds. Nowadays, when one asks those in the know, is it nature or nurture? They usually say, yes. And yet, understanding and easing or removing the suffering of said mass murderer could save untold numbers of lives. It's unlikely that starting the conversation with, you know, you're a psychotic mass murderer, will get one where they need to go. I can't help thinking we need to do better than that. What what that would be way above my pay grade. The process of being a human being means that each of us will develop our own mind, thing, mind relationship. And they will form the seeds, the biases with which we do a huge amount of world relating. Each of our brains is unique, and each of our experience sets are unique, and each of our sets of sensory input organs are unique. All create a unique creature, ourselves, living in a unique world. It stands to reason that just as we will never know all the whys and wherefores about ourselves, how can we believe we know them about another person or persons? Several years ago in Massachusetts, there was a study that brought together women who were on the opposite sides of a very visceral subject. They were interviewed on their views before the study started and again a year later. None of them had changed their minds about the polarizing subject, but they had all made friends on the other side. Perhaps they didn't change their minds, but they found out that the people on the other side of the conversation weren't evil. But all of these processes, it seems to me, are ego-driven. Help people to relax their death grip on their egos, relax the overwhelming desire to be right, to have certainty, and I suspect things will take a different turn. And it seems that's about what begins to happen when we learn to say, when we learn that it's okay to say, am I sure? If there seems to be a disconnect between groups of people today, know that our society is caught up in one of Ani Pema's Shenpas. Unwholesome seeds sprouting from our store consciousness, from our biases. And like any other Shenpa, the solution is the same. Do something different. Look at the others and know that they have Buddha nature. If they believe in difficult for us to grasp conspiracy theories, we can still know that they probably wish to experience happiness and avoid suffering, and that they live in a world of this is like this because that is like that. Our friend Yongey Minya Rinpoche says that when we embrace this Dharma, instead of closing your heart to people who yell at you or act in some other harmful way, you find yourself becoming more open. You recognize that they aren't just jerks, but are people who, like you, want to be happy and peaceful. They're only acting like jerks because they haven't recognized their true Buddha nature and are overwhelmed by sensations of vulnerability and fear. And in the all too often times when I'm the jerk, I see myself, I smile to myself, and I remind myself that sometimes my Buddha nature slips. My goal is to see it and watch it through the eyes of mindfulness, paying attention on purpose in the present moment with as little judgment as possible. Our way tells me that each time I look at that habit energy with mindfulness, it loses a little bit of its influence over me. Those of us who practice in the Plum Village tradition understand the need to contemplate and experience interbeing. I suspect that a true examination of interbeing of anything, anyone, anything, any process would need to be approached from a position of non-duality. Duality brings about attachment. Attachment, for or against, activates our seeds, our biases, puts on the blinders we use to cope with that which makes us uneasy, unnerved, uncomfortable, or that might make us feel right or moral or powerful. And how we experience any of this is based, of course, one more time, on things are things because of mind, as mind is mind because of things. Those who understand the nature of interbeing recognize that this is like this because that is like that. The people on the left of a subject are responding to what they believe about the people on the right. And yes, both the riders and the elephants are involved on both sides. Please don't underestimate the power of your elephant. And being practitioners of the middle way, perhaps we can be those who build bridges and forge connections. To find those difficult in our lives, bow to their Buddha nature and listen to understand, not to respond. When we bring a sense of non-duality to our practice, we can go that much deeper into acknowledging that our truth is not the final truth. We can become comfortable with, I'm not sure. When we live our lives in mindless duality, we miss a texture and a wonderment to our lives. We block off so much potential. As I try to dwell more and more in the realm of interbeing, I find it enjoyable to see the mirrored connections that spin off into infinity. As yet, I can't fully see the all of anything, of everything about anything, but at least I'm beginning to be aware of the extent of what I don't see. And I smile to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Wonderful talk. Let's see if we have questions both here in the center. I'll take my mask off. So here in the center or on Zoom. I think if you're in the center, the best thing to do would be to walk up to the computer and ask the question so that we don't end up having a lot of time with repeating. So anyway, any questions for Jim today? Yes, can you come forward? Just talk right there.
Hi, I'm Jim. First off, I really want to thank you and others for including this sutra, a piece in the conversation. It's been, since I read it in D.T. Suzuki's version long ago, it's been a seminal insight for me and earth-shaking, really. And to me, it's been something of a central contribution in my adult life, understanding this sutra and its implications for the world and for being in the world. It bears on the conversations we were having yesterday and last night, especially with the Arise group. And that is, for me then, as I experience it, is, and I'm going to try to keep this as short as I can. I'd love to talk for hours about it, but I don't know if I have it. If one, as I think many of us have, has experienced at least some glimpse of illumination from reading that passage and from other things in our lives, and we then have a sense of this, the value of this understanding of non-duality, and as Jim very eloquently discussed it. Then we go out into the world, and the world is full of contradictions, full of problems, injustice, and such. And for example, as to, say, the war in Vietnam, I am certain that there was a right side and a wrong side. It's more complicated than that, but I am certain that the United States was wrong. Now, that's a very complex thing. There is right and wrong, et cetera, on both sides, et cetera. But fundamentally, the United States was wrong. And the Vietnamese people, complicated as that is to say, were right in struggling against the US war. Or you could take Donald Trump's analysis of Charlottesville, where he said there are good people on both sides. Now, we may say that there is Buddha nature in all, including on both sides. And yet, I am certain that there was a right side and a wrong side in those protests. The wrong side were neo-fascists. They were shouting, Jews will not replace us. They were embracing a statute that honored slavery. They drove a car into peaceful protesters, killing someone. To me, there was a right side and a wrong side, and I cannot accept that a person with any sense of illumination could view that and not see with certainty that there was a right side and a wrong side. Again, there's more complexity than that. But that to me is, if you ask me, are you sure? Yes. So, for me, the question, and I cannot truly answer this, but the question is, if we go into the world with a sense of gratitude and illumination and non-dual nature, does that mean that we fail to discriminate between right action and wrong action? What is right action in the world? When we have Bob and Og, Jane and Job, we confront in the savannah a lion. It would be wise of us to understand the nature of that lion. Now, that lion may not attack us and eat us for lunch, but I'm going to have to assume that it will. And I'm not going to risk the naivete of facing that lion without that understanding. The same thing how I view people like Trump and such people. Yes, they may have their good nature. Yes, they may have goodness in them in some ways, but fundamentally, I'm not going to be naive and fail to understand what they intend to do to me and to others.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim, did you get all that?
Sure. And I think it was the central core of actually what I've actually been talking about, which is that we have this, and as a matter of fact, some of the research that I came across even talked about how we cannot totally embrace this concept of non-duality, because how else then do we determine what for us is a wise life or a wise way of living or an acceptable way of living? How do we determine what is right action for us without some sense of duality? Then when we multiply that by the fact that it's hardwired into our brain, this entire process. But that being said, and I know that this is a really tough one, but people doing what we see as bad things, they're often not seeing it as bad from their point of view. They can come up with an entire ways to justify what they're doing. And they have been since time immemorial. One of the examples that I've been pondering lately is that folks say, how could one person decide that they could own another person? And the answer was, well, up until about 300 years ago, everybody thought that they could own another person if they had the money. And so, and that's not, we know that that's not good. We know that that is a bad, immoral thing, that people should not own other people. But the fact of the matter is that the human brain first did it and then figured out ways to justify it. So all those people who are doing so many things to our world and to our society, they've got a reason for believing that what they are doing is right. And I don't know, I keep looking at it, and again, there's a difference between when we talk about accepting of a situation, there's a difference between acceptance and agreement. And in this particular, yeah. So the point being is that there's a time and a place for this non-duality. And then there's a time and place for us to be able to say, this is what I will do with my life. So.
Thank you, Jim. Anyone else? Yes, come on forward.
Hi, Jim. My name is Dave. I had a question about, it's a question about history. and it's something that you mentioned. Something I struggle with is the concept of, I don't know who first said it, but I heard it from Dory McKesson, which is the arc of justice, or if anybody knows this quote, help me.
The arc of
Justice bends, the arc of history bends toward justice.
Thank you. The arc of history bends towards justice. And I'll be honest, I think I used to believe that. I'm not quite sure I do anymore, because I'm more on the side of that history just continues to repeat itself. So I think my question is one more of, somebody who has studied this and been alive a while, is really, are we sort of bending towards justice, or are we just continuing to sort of retreat into our own tribes, and what that looks like? I don't know if it's so much of a question as something that I just struggle with daily, is the, and I know it's duality to say either the arc of history bends towards justice or it doesn't, fundamentally. But this is something that I think about a lot, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts or insights on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
We have to, I keep coming back to the same thing. We'll go back to the quote from Pema Chodron about working within, trying to solve injustice from working within duality. I don't know. One of the biggest leaps for me was not to jump to these people doing these things are bad, or that they're doing them for bad reasons. One of my favorite authors was a man named Robert Heinlein, and years ago he created something that was eventually called Heinlein's razor. And it says that it's usually a mistake to attribute to evil that which is most easily explained by stupidity. There we go. And our Dharma tells us that people who act in a destructive way towards themselves or towards others are deluded. They don't see they don't have what we would call a proper viewpoint of the universe, of the world. And that has to do with interbeing. So, like, for instance, when you believe that you, an overweight, six foot tall, inherited trust fund baby, when you believe that you built this building called Trump Tower, you built it. And it couldn't have been built without you. When you believe things of that nature, then, you don't understand interbeing. And to be perfectly honest, all these things that, again, I mentioned Dr. Stalder's blog in regards to biases and formations. And some of it's almost as if what we're going through is necessary for our society. Are we going to make it through this? Are we moving towards an arc of justice? Well, the wetware that we have in here and in here is saying no, but we have the ability to change what goes on. Remember, the neurons that fire together wire together. And so if we simply set about deciding that this is a behavior that does not serve me anymore, does not serve me the way I need to, we're going to have to do it one at a time. So I don't have any answers. So I can only my interpretations. So
Thank you, Jim. Anyone else? Yes, Bridget, come on forward. There you can see her. Wow, great.
Thank you for your Dharma talk.
Bridget, you could take your mask down if you want to ask the question, sure.
In the spirit of what you said about beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. I would like to offer the possibility that people who do harm are not only driven by delusion and fear, but also by aggression and greed, the will to power and self-interest. I'm thinking of, this is another tradition, in the Christian tradition, Jesus says, the children of the darkness are wiser than the children of the light. The children of the light being those of us who care for the common good and believe that all possess the Buddha nature. It is in my belief, and that's influenced my belief, that the children of the darkness are wiser in the ways of the world. They are self-interested and greedy, and they seek to do harm, not because they're deluded, but because they're wise. Reinhold Niebuhr, in reflecting on this truth, said the children of the light need to be as wise as the serpent and as harmless as the dove. That is in the Christian tradition and not in the Buddhist tradition. And this is, again, a comment that I offer in the spirit of non-harming. But when you said earlier that until 300 years ago, everybody thought that people could own other people, that excludes the consciousness of Black and brown people who were enslaved by those people who believed that people could be property. It excluded women. It is the consciousness of white property-owning men that believed that people could be property. So I offer that in the spirit of concern, that the belief that all is one in the consciousness of the dominant culture can become a universalizing tendency to say that all consciousness is my consciousness. Thank you.
Jim?
Yeah, thank you. As a matter of fact, of all the things that I've been saying, the one thing I was saying is that my consciousness is not all consciousness. As a matter of fact, what I was asking is that we begin to ask ourselves, is my view of the world, or actually knowing that my view of the world is not the true or the only view of the world, and that I think it would be pretty egotistical to decide that what I have decided and what I choose to believe, and the way I see the world and or situations is the way that it must be seen. There are other ways, and all I've been saying all along is that the world would become better, or no, it appears that we can overcome a great deal of these roadblocks in humanity if we could simply let go of that death grip on our egos and begin to admit that I could be wrong. Now, as far as some of the other things, some of the delusions and bad things that happen in our world by people who do these things, this is simply what they were taught. They don't know any better. Remember, I talked about a quote from I think it was from Mingyur Rinpoche about how when people do these things, it's simply because they don't understand that they have Buddha nature, and everyone has it, but and that's where I was going with this. I once sat in an evening with John Kabat-Zinn and the gentleman from, somebody's going to help me here, the gentleman from Madison, the Institute for Healthy Minds.
Richie Davidson.
Thank you. Thank you, Richie Davidson. And Richie Davidson stood up and he's on the stage, and he said his research of the last several years had finally gotten him some faith in the human race, because they had seemed to have discovered that there were pathways in the human brain that were specifically designed for compassion, compassionate acts and compassionate processes. The thing about it, though, and he compared it very much to the brain space that was laid out for speech. And he said, we have a propensity, just as we have, as humans have a propensity to use speech, we have a propensity for compassion. But he also said that just as we have to learn to use speech, we also have to learn compassion. And people, and then we don't even teach about why speech, but the point is that just as we have a propensity for speech, we have a propensity for compassion, but just as speech has to be taught, compassion has to be taught. And we have free will, so we have the ability. Again, this business with Buddha nature and compassion, the best I can do is to take an attitude of they simply weren't taught. And I don't know. Paul and I have tried to work in some fairly difficult situations with some fairly difficult cultural beliefs, that until we can get past these cultural beliefs, it's going to be very difficult. And again, that's what we're dealing with. So sorry if I got kind of long-winded, but.
Thank you, Jim. Come on forward.
Hi, Jim. This is Ann. Can you speak a little bit about how some of the issues we have with duality and non-duality, and understanding that and trying to get others maybe to understand that in relation to the English language, and read that the English language and Western languages are sort of, they're dual. That's how they're set up. But that Eastern languages have more of a feeling way of describing the world. Can you speak to that and how that might contribute to the way people think here in the States?
Absolutely. Thank you so very much. It was one of those that as I was, excuse me, I started scribbling myself notes here so I don't lose track of what I'm trying to talk about. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I am only conversant in one language, and that is English. And you are absolutely correct. We are filled with this process of duality. As a matter of fact, those of you with more formal education than I might actually know something about the fact that, for instance, we have probably have a duality tautology that is passed down to us from the Greeks, and in regards to understanding and rationalizing. But the other thing about it, particularly in English, and again, that's the only thing I can speak from, is that it is so, our language is so entrenched in violence and in opposition that we can't think of another way. For instance, one of the things that one of the things I've thought about kind of extensively is that take your pick. If you watch the Food Network, for instance, they might have, they got a program called Beat Bobby Flay. And everybody decides that they're going to pick out some particular dish that they can make as well as this professional. And it's always a competition. It's always a competition. And I'm thinking to myself, how about joining in something like Enhance Bobby Flay, so that instead of, each one of you take your best shot at something, and then you figure out how to upscale that so you feed 250 homeless people. Instead of having competition, show people how cooperation can make things. But particularly, it seems to me, particularly in the American society, we are so tied into this aggressive language and so tied into this I got to get mine attitude. One of the things that's been hitting me lately is the ones being someone who is on Social Security. I have to listen to all these old-timey people talk about getting what I'm entitled to. Getting what I'm entitled to doesn't mean anything whether you need it or not. But we have this idea in our society that I must get what I'm entitled to. So.
Thank you, Jim. Anyone else here in the audience? Or on Zoom, if there's anybody on Zoom that has a question.
Yeah, this is Lynn. I just wanted to thank you, Jim, for the talk. And I think it's really hard for you or anyone to solve the problems in our nation with duality. But I do feel like what's going on, especially with the pandemic now, I just saw somebody on TV this morning that was very emotional, that said that the way we're treating people in the hospital, we're not giving them the treatment that they need, and that would cure people, not the vaccine. And very tied into that opinion. And, of course, the science seems not to say that, but I feel like our nation is so dualistic now, and that we're so harming ourselves with the dualistic attitudes and different camps. And, we do say America calls themselves a Christian nation, but you never hear anybody say, love your enemies, a very, very important message from the Christian faith is to love your enemies. And I just thought what you had said about trying to reach, to make bridges would be what we need to do. I mean, I don't feel, I know I'm not right. My perceptions are wrong on a lot of things. And so I feel like that might be what you talked about might be the best answer for overcoming some of the problems that we're having right now.
Thank you. I refer back to my portion of the talk about my friend of 45 years. And interestingly, as I was going through all of this, I came across a study that talked about how best to work with these folks who might have attitudes that are not in the best interest of most of us or others of us. And the answer was that it cannot be done, according to research, it cannot be done wholesale. The best that can be done, or the best way that they have figured out to eliminate some of this duality, is, as we talked about the Massachusetts study, to be able to get people to understand that there are multiple sides to this story, and to every situation, there's multiple sides to it. And believe me, the folks who are trying to restrict voter, they're involved in voter suppression. Okay, I don't think it needs to be said, but I don't think that's a good idea. I think that everybody, the point being is that those folks think that they're right. Excuse me. Those folks think that they're right. And again, okay, so they're deluded, but it's not going to do us any good to walk up to them and say, you're deluded. We have to understand, and somebody else was saying the other night that, well, these folks who are doing all this stuff, they don't seem like they should be all that insecure to me, because I said, this is insecurity bringing itself out. Well, you know, as a matter of fact, it was, after all, they're mostly white middle-class people who are doing this kind of stuff. Well, they're scared. And maybe they're not scared about things that you and I consider to be important, but maybe they don't have the information that we have, you know? Again, coming back to the same old thing, I understand about interbeing, and that brings a certain amount of, oh, well, that's a wonderment into my life. But if you don't have that, then it's really easy to fall into, they're out to get me. And I think it was Pema Chodron who said, when hate fills your heart, you see enemies everywhere. And so, sorry, I got kind of lost as to where we were going with that, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, dear friends, for all of your wonderful questions and all of your great wisdom. We'll put Jim's, next week, all these talks will be online, and we absolutely would just love to have Jim up here sometime again, and as well as Letitia. We miss you, Letitia, every morning. We're walking without you. I say, what's going on? There's someone missing there. You know, and Lynn, we already had Art Hut stories about you. So anyway, there we go. So thank you all, and we'll be in a few minutes. We'll be in 10 minutes or so. We'll be doing walking meditation outside. We have wonderful movement today, and Jim, I'll see you on Monday. We'll solve the world's problem, whatever world's problems are left over after this talk.
Thank you so very much, all.
We'll clean up the rest of them then. So thank you much.
Thank you all.
Silent applause, everyone. Here we go.